welcome to the next video in the build series. Go into your hardware bag and pull out the two M4 by 20 millimeter bolts and 4 of the M3 by 25. These are the ones that have the highest count in the bag. I think there's 16 of them. So pull 4 of those out. Pull 6 of the bearings, or all the bearings, out. And find in your kit the cantilevers and the main cross member along with the left and right sides. We're going to make it look like this in a couple of minutes of work here. Now you can position these with the hardware on the outside or the inside. This particular piece has it on the inside. You can also see the orientation of the uprights. The offset is towards the inside. So let's go ahead and build that now. So there's no orientation to this piece. You can either do the smooth or the textured side out. I think we'll run it with the textured side out. And these brackets are designed to fit in these grooves, totally square and flush. So when you're driving the M3 hardware in, you want to pay careful attention to making sure that this stays lined up. You don't want to break any of the pieces you're putting together. So I like to put a little downward pressure, and I also squeeze the piece together and then go ahead and drive it in, keeping the bolt square. All right, so you'll feel it bottom out or snug up. Same on the bottom. Squeeze the piece together, a little downward pressure. Okay, that's one side done. Again, pay attention to the orientation here. M3 by 25. Push down, squeeze the part together. Last one. Looks good. Now let's build our cantilevers. So again, you can run these either way with the hardware in or out, and you can see that they are paired up. You can decide to run this textured side out if you'd like, or switch those pieces around and run the smooth side. I like the textured side out, so that's what we're going to run on both. So just like that. So now we're going to go back into our bin of miscellaneous bolts, and we're going to pull out a bunch of the shorter bolts. So these are about 8 millimeters long, and that's just fine. Hopefully the wind noise outside isn't too annoying, but the shutters are rattling and it's howling because it is blowing today. Don't know why. So you can see I'm grabbing a few of these 10 millimeter and a few of the 8. This will get us started on both. So this isn't super structural. I did the hardware more for aesthetics. So just line these up and start sending them home. so our cantilevers are done. The bearings have a slight friction fit. I like to start them from the side that has the thinner plate, or the piece that the hardware goes through. So just put 3 on each and make sure they're centered up. There you go, one done. Again, from the hardware side, you can do it from the other side, but that plate seam might hang up, so I like to push them in from this side. All right, cantilevers are done. Let's switch out our driver for the 2.5 millimeter driver, and these two are going to thread through the bracket and into the other side partially. If you put this in crooked and start to drive this into the bracket rather than the opening, you can break this tab off. It's pretty thick, but pay attention to what you're doing. Also note the orientation of these cantilevers. The sort of the longer looking side goes to the back. Again, you can run it hardware out or texture out. I like the hardware out, so we're going to do that again. So in this case, texture out, hardware out, and we're ready to start the bolt. Now I'm going to start it without anything in, just to cut the... What I was saying is just to cut the threads, but that's, you could hear it doing that. So really critical again, make sure that this is totally lined up. The best tactic I found for that is to partially start the hardware just so it barely protrudes. So you can see it right there. That might even be a little bit much, so I'm going to back it up just by hand. Just something like that. Put my bracket in, and I'm going to sort of feel where the bearing is. Again, you do not want to drive this in not lined up with the bearing, so turn it by hand. If you're using a speed driver, make sure that's on the bearing. That looks good. If you're not handy with a speed driver, you don't have a feel for it, just turn this in by hand. All right, so at this point we want to make sure that this bracket stays perpendicular. So I like to push it in just a little bit, a little inward pressure, and that seems to do the trick. There we are. Same for the other side. I'm going to go ahead and start this one first, and then back it out. Again, we're doing hardware out on this, or the long piece to the back if you don't want hardware out. And we're going to let this protrude just slightly. Just like that. Drop our bracket in. And it looks like we're centered there. I'm going to start it by hand again just to make sure that I'm inside the bearing. All right, that looks good. All right, both cantilevers are installed. At this point, let's grab our chassis, and we're going to install this assembly in the rear section of the chassis. Now you can see lots of bolts here, lots of bolt openings. Those correspond to the ones in this bracket, but we're not going to utilize them all. It's actually used for some other parts later on, but we are going to slide it all the way forward on the chassis. just like that. And you can see once it bottoms out, all of these holes align. So what we're going to do is we're going to put one in the last hole, and we're going to put one in the first hole. We're going to use these medium length bolts here. So, you know, an M10 would, M3 by 10 would do the trick. So let's grab a couple of those, or 4 of those, I should say. There we are. And let's go ahead and put those in. So as you drive these, you'll feel the bracket sort of pull into the C channel of the frame. So you want to make sure those are fully seated. But again, don't over tighten them and pull threads out. Turn them by hand if you have to, just to get a feel for it. All right, so if you did everything right, the back of your truck should start to look like this. Hardware in place, cantilevers installed with bearings, and a nice free motion there. So next video, we're going to work on some of the front end. All right, so for this next part, we're going to work on the front of the chassis, and you need to locate the front body mount, the funny looking bracket for the front, and the bracket for the super scale. So let's prep that first. You can see I took a little liberty here and put my IG handle there. We're still reusing this M3 hardware, so an M3 by about an 8 is fine. We're just going to put this hold down bracket in. When you have a super scale in your hand, you'll understand what that's for. That holds it down nice and square and perpendicular and parallel in the chassis. All right, that's ready. So locate in your kit these little nubs. There are 4 of them. 2 are optional, but we definitely need 2 right now. And the length of the bolt that holds these down is important. So you can do a few things up here. This is the front body mount. You can run a bolt and a washer through the top if you want a nice flush look using the stock body. You could put magnets on here and attach them to your body. But this is basically to utilize the stock setup. The bolts that are the perfect length are actually the ones that are in the chassis here at the front of the edge before the bend. So if we pull that out and we put it right into the body mount, we're going to be in good shape. Now these are pretty tough to hold, and they're small. You can see me knocking stuff around. Grab your original body pins, find the hole in the top, put your body pin through it, like that, and you're able to hold it while you put the M3 bolt through. Okay, and I like them front to back, so we're going to do the same on the other side. Let's pull out the other side here, just so we don't pull the whole frame apart. And we'll put some longer ones back in that space later on. So the body mount is ready. This goes into the frame right here, these last 2 holes with the tabs facing forward. I don't like to put that in yet though, because we're going to be doing some work up here, and when you're installing the super scale later on and mounting your suspension servos, It's best to just have this out of the way so you can adjust the servo arm positions. But it's really easy to install. You can take some M3 hardware, run it through. You can put a nut on the back. I didn't find that necessary. If you just put 4 bolts on it, it tends to hold itself in place. So that's ready. This bracket's ready. Let's prep the main bracket that holds everything together up front. So this taper goes towards the front, and here's where we mount our servos later on for the suspension. Pass the servo wires through that opening, and you have a clean shot back to the super scale, which mounts right there. So before we mount anything, we need to prep the steering servo. We need to change a couple of things on it. One, we need to flip the button head to the horn side of the servo arm. So we're going to move it now. Also, we won't need or use this much steering angle, so we're actually going to go into the middle hole. Put it right back together. You'll see later on when we work on the front axle that we need to turn the stops in, otherwise it binds. It's just that way from the factory. Or at least it's been that way on the last few kits that I've done. Okay. We also need to flip this hardware, or the servo brackets over. These are the original bolts. They are too short for the servo, but they are perfect to put back in the frame, which is what we're going to do right here. And go back into your kit and pull out your M3 by, these are about 12 or so. And we're going to use that to mount the servo. So the servo orientation is, like I said, we actually have to flip these brackets over, so let's go back and do that. So we're going to reuse the hardware here. Just turn the bracket 180 degrees, reinstall. You can leave these a little bit loose to help alignment when we're putting in the new hardware. Again, loosen the bolt. Just flip it 180 degrees. Put the bolt back in the other side. All right, so they're tight, but they still move around. So at this point, I'm going to take our bracket and we're going to install our servo with the spline facing the back of the truck and lining up these two holes, and it's going to look like something like that when we're done. We're going to take those longer M3s and using the same trick that we did on the other side, we're just going to start those so they go just past the surface, and that'll help us line up on the servo bracket. Get your first one started. Leaving it a little bit loose, we're going to do the other side. Tighten it the rest of the way. And now finish off your hardware that we left loose. All right, so that's ready to install. And you'll notice there are 3 holes on either side, which correspond to the 3 holes on the chassis. And again, still reusing the hardware we removed. I grabbed the M3 by 10 or 12s, and I grabbed 6 of them. Line your bracket up, and go ahead and drive those home. see that one resisted a little bit. Just put inward pressure on it. All right, so that tightens up the front end considerably. All right, we're zoomed in a little bit more, and now we are working on the rear axle. So in your kit, find these little flat pieces with grooves. These are not only your vise to hold your axle while you're working on it, but it's also the amount that you need to trim off. Find your axle caps, they kind of look like a P, and grab some of the longer M3 out of your recovered bolts. You're going to need your flat file, and you're going to need a small pin which you can actually insert through the hex pin opening, and we're going to do that in just a little bit. So first step is to disassemble this axle further, and we're going to pull everything apart. So pull these end caps off. Again, saving our hardware. So the axle comes out with it. Push the bearing back out. Set that aside, set your axle aside. Won't be reusing this. Push your bearing back out. Put our axles aside. The left and the right are completely symmetrical. Now I'm going to pull the diff out so I can show you what's going on in here. And this is really critical that you take your time and test fit and test fit and test fit till you get it perfect. If you take off too much material and you like to tow heavy trailers and put big motors in, you run the risk of rounding out these axles. And the worse job you do, the more you risk that. So just slowly work up to the perfect fit, and I'm going to show you what that is right now. There's our pinion carrier. There's our diff. And we're going to leave this open for a little while we work. So if you turn the diff on its side, you look super close, you'll see that there are a pair of flat spots on the axle that correspond to flat spots on the diff, right? So it fits in like that. We need to replicate that, but we have to trim off this amount. The other thing you'll notice, and this is really hard to see on camera, so I'm going to show it with the caliper. There's a tiny shoulder here. So we're gonna measure inside the shoulder. You can see it's about 4.4 millimeters. And if we go to the shoulder, it's about 4.5 or even 4.6. So we need to actually grind or sand that down to match the diameter that's to the outside of the shoulder. So it's critical that we actually cut it first, then we grind it down to match that diameter, that 4.4, and then we file the flat spot. So that's the next couple of videos. So your setup in the vise to cut it's going to be to put your clamp / guide right to the end of the axle and then trim it right here, right? So you're just going to take your saw or your Dremel. Again, I don't suggest the Dremel. I'm going to use a handsaw on my desk and just trim that. It doesn't take much more than 45 seconds to cut that nice and flush. So we're going to do that now, and then we're going to come back. We're going to do that to both axles in the same way using our vise and guide. All right, so we've got our axle and our vise with the end flush to the clamps, and we're going to trim it right here. All right, we're back from the vise, and you should have two stubs cut off, the parts with the flat spots, and you should have two totally round axles. At this point, here's where we do the poor man lathe, and we're going to chuck this up. We're going to clamp onto this flat surface, not the threaded portion, so we don't tear up the threads. And now, using the tools like this, turn your Dremel on and spin your drill up. We're going to sand it down. Now the number we're looking for, again, is about 4.4. Your reference is this piece in front of the shoulder. There's your 4.4. And your piece that you have to sand down is at about 4.55 or 4.6. There we go. So it doesn't take long. Using these two tools, you're probably looking at 30 to 45 seconds of sort of sanding and grinding. So don't take off too much. We want it to be a perfect fit once we file it down to fit it in here, just like the stock piece, right? So that's what's happening right here. So we're gonna go do that now. Again, work slowly and let's sand it down. You need to sand obviously at least that distance. So, you know, about 20 millimeters. You can go further. Maybe about 2 fingers would be perfect. Actually, that's a lot for my fingers. Anyway, match that length. That's about 20 millimeters. We'll be back. We're back now from turning down the two axles. All right. So we want to check. This is where the caliper comes in handy. We're looking for about 4.4. So you can see right there, looks pretty good. At this point, we're going to want to take a Sharpie and paint these totally black so we can see the next step, which is the filing. Again, it's better to take off a small amount at a time and just keep double checking, If you don't have that caliper, just use your stock pieces and compare those diameters. You can maybe put them on a flat table. You could feel them with your fingers, but they need to match up. And we're going to do the same thing now on the flat side. So again, we're going to use our vise. This time we're just going to clamp it, or I'm sorry, we're going to use our plastic pieces here, and we're going to clamp it in the vise. And this is where having this 1.5 millimeter driver comes in handy. So what this allows you to do is to orientate the piece so it's vertical. That means when you file here, if you spin the piece 180 degrees, put your marker back in from the top, you can very accurately get that also totally perpendicular to the ground. So when you file parallel to the ground, you're going to have two opposing flat spots, which is what matches up in this diff. Now again, it's better to go slow here rather than fast. And you want to take your diff over to your vise or bring this back in and keep checking until you get a nice perfect slip fit into the diff. An easy way to do that is to take your cutoff pieces, keep those near the vise, and just visually look at that flat spot. Now I know it's pretty hard because it's black on black, but hopefully you see the reflection at some point where you'll be able to compare what's going to be the silver area on the axle shaft. So let's go do that now. All right, so here we are back at our small vise. You can see we have our locating pin. So we know that this axle is vertical, or this piece is vertical, and therefore when we file here flat, we're going to get a nice flat spot, and we're going to do the same on the other side by rotating the axle over. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so you can see we've got one side filed, and we're going to match it up to the flat spot on the original axle. So that looks pretty good. Again, take your time, go slow, take a little bit off each side, and then go check in your diff. That's our axles now trimmed, turned, and filed down to fit the diffs. So let's put everything back together. Let's put your diff back in. It only goes one way. Pay attention to the orientation of the pinion housing. These tabs and this hole both go up, so make sure you return it the same way. Good. And let's put our hardware back in. So the wind is still blowing and it's making the shutters howl and bang, but let's get through this. All right, so let's take our bearings and we're going to put them in the axle housing. Let's make sure they're fully seated. But let's put our axle in first. Pop that back out. So again, there's no left and right. Slide that in. And let's push the bearing in again. Make sure it's fully seated. Just making sure that's all the way down. All right, so that's where these pieces come into play now. We've got our axle caps. These grooves go to the top, and you can see there's sort of a thicker, and then there's a thinner side. The thinner side is where we put the hardware through. And we want to make sure we have a right length bolt here. So that's short. Let's just use these longer ones. Again, still using everything left over from the original hardware when we took the truck apart. So slide this over the end. It's a little bit of a friction or snap fit. You can see there's a groove that corresponds to one on the top of the axle. There it is, and you can see it now retaining the bearing. Same on the other side. So make sure that's fully seated. Press in on both. Now let's put our hardware in. Again, if you're not handy with the speed driver, take it slow. And we're going to go in from the thin side on both sides. So the thin side here. Just get that so you can just see that deform or clamp in. We don't have to go crazy there. Again, starting from the thin side. All right, so now we have our bearings retained, and we can put some of this away. All right, so next step will be installing some axle plates, so let's get to that part. Now let's go into our hardware bag, pull out the remaining M3 by 25s, should be 12, so you're going to put 6 for the back and 6 for the front axle, and then find the two longest and only M3 by 30s. So lay out your axles so they look something like this. This rear plate that has no holes in the center section, right? So there's holes here, no holes here, that goes to the back. Then it's your rear axle. Then it's the plate that has the holes. Then you'll see these two pieces that look similar. One is thicker and one is thinner. Put the thicker one behind the front axle and the thinner one to the front of the front axle. So let's talk about the truss themselves. These two pieces are identical. So those are going to sit the rear facing forward and the front facing back. If you plan to run a trailer, this is the same truss, but with an added structure for an M5 or M4, I forget what size, for the common quick connectors that look like this. So you can find these on eBay, but they're perfect scale fifth wheel. They work well, and then you would thread this into your fifth wheel trailer, and hopefully I'll be building one of those pretty soon. So we're not doing the trailer right now, so let's get started on assembly. So make sure your orientation is correct. So these holes are up with these tabs facing up on the axles. We're going to remove the 4-link mount and we're going to mount it on this plate, and it actually goes on the inner holes. So pay attention again to orientation. This hole goes up into the inside and mounts to the center of the 6 holes, so the center 2 holes. So let's do that now. Again, still reusing hardware. Same orientation with the hole up and in the center 2 opening. So now we're ready to install some of these longer M3 by 25s. You'll notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes around the arch section, front and rear. So we're going to do the same process front and rear. Rear plate. So it should look like that. Put your truss in between and put your front plate on. You'll see when you find the right spot, it sort of snaps into place or finds home. There we go. So let's get these 30s out of the way so we don't put them in by mistake. Again, I'm squeezing these parts together, get rid of any gaps. So right there, didn't do a good job squeezing it together. Let's try it again. Keep trying to go for those 30s. I gotta move them further away. So we can reuse some of the nylock nuts that are in here on these top 2. It's really overkill anywhere else. It's up to you if you want to put extra hardware on there, but there's a lot of bite going through the axle and through these plates. So hopefully you charged up your speed driver and you listened to me in the early videos to actually buy one, otherwise you're going to be dying right about now. Again, squeeze these together. See a little gap here? Want to squeeze that together, get rid of the gap. Of these 6. Again, squeeze the part together, get rid of any gaps between the plates and the housing. All right. So now we've got our truss built on the rear axle. Again, if you feel compelled, grab a couple of your M3 nylocks and kind of makes sense to put them on the top one here, but again, you can hear how much bite those M3 25s have. So this is likely overkill. Okay. Now let's grab some of our longer hardware and let's finish off these sides. Those are a little bit short. Let's go in here and let's grab some longer hardware. There you go, it's perfect. So 4 of these. And we're just going to run them through the outer edges of the truss. So all the hardware is going in from the back of the rear axle. Again, pushing the plates together. All right, so there's our completed rear axle. It's narrowed. We've got a 4-link conversion on it, and all these links are brought in because those size of those rear dualies are just massive. In order to get inside the body, we had to pull everything inboard. So that took quite a bit of work, but we're there. Front end's a little bit easier, less hardware. Same process. Again, the thinner bracket goes towards the pumpkin or the front of the front axle. The thicker bracket goes towards the pinion side, and the truss faces backwards or towards the center of the truck. Grab your M3 by 25s again. And there were my 30s. Keep those out of the way. So M3 by 25s, and again, same as the rear axle. squeeze the axle together. Squeeze the plates together. Sounds like I'm going to have to charge my driver up here before we do the next video. Just about dead. See if we can make it through the last two. Last bolt, and we'll come back. Grab another M3 nylock. And we're going to put it on the upper two again. As you can hear, probably complete overkill, but they're there, so we'll just put a couple on. All right, so let's not lose these longer M3x30s. They're actually what hold our links in place. We're gonna go ahead and put them in now, and we'll call the axles done. All right, congrats. That's the front and rear axles ready to reinstall. That's probably the most work in the entire kit. Next video is going to be link assembly. So go ahead and pull out your stock 3-link with panhard rear and 3-link with panhard front, and find in your kit the lower links. Also find the 8 square nuts and the 4 rod ends, and we're going to build our new links. So first part is we're going to be reusing the stock lower links as our stock upper links. So you can put those aside. We are going to be reusing the stock lower links, but up front, but with new rod ends. So go ahead and take those apart. So remove your rod ends on both sides. Now, you can grip these a bunch of different ways, but one of these Techno tools works really well. Thread on our new link end, rod end. Set that link aside. Do one more. Hear the wind still blowing outside. It's been crazy today. All right. So now we're going to take apart the panhard links. Those are the ones that have this offset ball with sort of the flange side, because we need to get the grub screws out of these two so we can reuse them on the front lower links. Let's go ahead and do that now. So I've actually got a special tool. I think this is from Team Garage Hack. If you have one of these, great. If not, keep doing it the way I was just showing you, but we're gonna speed things up a little bit. If I get it to start. We won't need that rod end. Or this one. We're gonna take those grub screws out in just a second. We do need these rod ends. Rod ends for our lower links. We need to remove the grub screws and insert them along with the square nuts into the new lower links. So orientation, the center of the truck would be here. This is the front and the rear, so the short links go up front, the long rings go out rear, and then the bends are towards the outer edges of the truck. Take these square nuts, drop them into the top of the link. Make sure it's fully seated. You can push down on that however you want, and that'll help us line things up. So again, drop them in, fully seated. And now we're going to take some of our grub screws. In this case, we could actually just screw this whole piece in, but I like to do it as a separate process if we can. Now you can actually see this side is the male side, so I can't actually get our 1.5 on it. So we're going to just thread it in one shot. So make sure that's nice and square. And let's get that started. So you'll want to turn till this is basically fully seated. So right about there. And we'll remove one of the grub screws from here. I'll show you the other process so we can get to that one. Put the link aside. And if you look carefully, you can see how that's lined up. All right, so we're going to put the grub screw in. And you want to go till it's just below the level of the new link. And then thread this down till you feel some resistance. So right about there. All right, so that's one lower link done. We're going to do the same process on the rest. not want those.